Hello and welcome to Culture Vibes, the Federal special program in which we talk to writers and artists about their work. Today, we are going to talk about a period in Indian history that has, by and large, stayed off the radar of historians. Between December 1941 and mid 1942, a number of cities in India, including Madras and Calcutta, were gripped by panic because of rumors of a full-fledged Japanese invasion that never happened. Mukund Padmanabhan, former editor of The Hindu and Hindu Business Line, who is now a visiting professor at Kriya University in Chennai, has written a marvelous book on this little-known period. Deeply researched and exquisitely written, the book, called The Great Flap of 1942, How the Raj Panicked Over a Japanese Known Invasion, has been published by Penguin. Mukund, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Entirely my pleasure, Naveen.
So just to give our audience a glimpse of the cover, this is the book. As I mentioned, it's deeply researched, very well written. It just from the word go. So at the outset, Mukund, you write in the foreword that it was a story crying out to be written because it was not just about the panic and flight of people, but also about the displacement and loss. Now, why do you think the exodus of people from different cities in India at that point of time has been forgotten?
I refer to it in the book somewhat, and someone who's done, a friend of mine who's done work on the period has actually put it very succinctly. A historian called Kamtekar, who says that the scare that Japan caused, he suggests it fell between two historical stools. It didn't fit into either grand narrative, that of decolonization or that of transfer of power. So neither British nor Indian historians were looking at this event. They were more focused on the struggle for independence, or what they saw, Indian historians particularly. So I think the story has fallen by the wayside. You mentioned Madras and Calcutta. I think
there are other cities also.
People who worked on Madras and Calcutta are aware that there was an exodus from these two cities. But I think what the book establishes is that the panic was pretty much widespread and pan-Indian. And, the exodus happened from the most unexpected of places, including hill stations. Ahmedabad records people have left, even though it's nowhere near the eastern coastline. So, yes, this was information I discovered only when I started researching this. I myself believe that the book might be largely about Madras and Calcutta, but even though Madras and Calcutta form important parts of it, what I try to suggest is that the exodus was pretty much pan-Indian. Yeah. And the panic was pan-Indian, yeah.
Right. That also, I think, included Cuttack in Orissa, isn't it?
Well, this is the other kind of story that's fallen by the wayside. Not many people know, and I've spoken to Oriya politicians and some academics. Not many people know, for instance, that the governor of Orissa was so worried about Japanese invasion that he actually shifted the capital from Cuttack to Sambalpur inland. So did Cochin. It moved the secretariat to Thrissur. So these are stories that have kind of fallen by the wayside, and I think deserve to be told and recounted.
Right. No, as readers, we are grateful that you do that. And the story also, Mukund, that unfolds in the backdrop of the World War II, specifically the Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia, and you have written in detail about what happened in Malaya and Singapore, And the question that I wanted to ask you is, did you broaden the narrative arc to cover this larger story of the war and its repercussions? Because Japan had entered the war in December 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question, because when I set out to write the book, I had only a dim idea of the structure it would take. But as I started researching the book, I found it was important to have, as you say, a much broader narrative arc. And because the panic in India was very much related to the quick and rapid Japanese successes in Southeast Asia, starting with the attack on Malaya, the fall of Singapore, Hong Kong fell, There were other places that the Burma they went into, and then they took Rangoon. So they won everything. This was, in those days, there wasn't a battle that they lost. The British lost every battle. So it was a Japan on the rampage virtually at that time. And so I found that with every successive defeat had an echo in India. And there was a relationship between the pattern of the Exodus and the events in Southeast Asia. So it became important for me to narrate the speed and the successes in Southeast Asia that Japan had, and link it to the kind of impact it had on Exodus and on Indian politics in general. So that as well.
Right. Madras was a curious case. It was the first Indian city established by the British Empire, but also the kind of mayhem that it caused there. I mean, we'll talk about the other aspects, but if you could just give us a sense of what kind of panic was caused in Madras because of this rumor that happened.
Well, I'll start by saying that the first city that went into a panic was Calcutta. Okay. I mean, a week or two after Japan attacked Malaya, people started fleeing Calcutta, and within about a period of a fortnight, about almost 20% of the population of Calcutta had fled. And this was in December 1941. In Madras was an outlier in this sense that it was the only city where the government, of Governor Arthur Hope at that time, the British government, British Indian government, actually advised people to leave. So everyone who they regarded as inessential, or sometimes rather coldly described as useless mouths, or had no business in the city, were advised to leave the city. And they wanted only people engaged in the essential services and the army that was there to stay on. So, and the reason for this, why Madras went so far, is that there was military intelligence, so-called military intelligence, that a Japanese fleet was going to come and make landfall in what is now the southern coast of Tamil Nadu in April 1942. And of course, this was not true at all. The Japanese were in the Indian Ocean. The Japanese bombed Colombo and Trincomalee. They bombed Visakhapatnam and Kakinada around that time in early April. But there was no fleet coming towards Madras. There was no plan to make landfall. And as a result, there was an evacuation order. And so the panic and the flight from Madras was particularly was large. It was also a big city. And there are various estimates. So conservatively, I think about 75% of the population fled. But I suggest in the book that there are estimates that suggest that, it could have been almost 90%. And that's a figure I don't find, I find credible. It was possible. We don't know for sure. We can't actually estimate how many people fled. But if you sort of add up the numbers and look at the estimates, it was a city that virtually emptied itself out. So did Visakhapatnam. There was sizable exodus from Bombay, for instance. There's the Times of India records that there was a certain period when 25% of the city had gone, and there were parts of Bombay that were virtually empty, flat, shuttered up, and so on. So this was a pan-Indian issue, and I think the amount of panic and flight all over the country, in the Northeast as well, is something that has been largely unmapped. And so one of the attempts in the book was trying to map this. And all for nothing, because there was no invasion.
Yeah, and that makes it much more in that sense.
I mean, it was this sort of, almost, I describe it in the novel as kind of, it's the sort of dystopian, futility to the whole thing. Which I think makes the story somewhat interesting and almost gives it a kind of fictional feel.
Right. And it was also something that the British fueled in some way, but also they found themselves unable to control it, isn't it?
Well, the British, I think, fueled it by mixed messaging. The British fueled it by the fact that we now know that the British wanted people in so-called threatened cities to leave. There is enough communication, and I was surprised. I didn't know this when I started researching the book, and I haven't read this anywhere else. There's enough communication between the Viceroy Linlithgow and its governors in different places, which essentially says that our policy is that we want what he describes as useless mouths to leave. So that if the Japanese attack, or the Japanese even bomb the city, then the sort of administration would be in a better position to kind of manage the city. And if the city was, fully packed with people, as it normally is, then the bombing would be very, very difficult to handle. So they're actually quite happy that people left. They didn't shed any tears about it. They were just worried all the time that if people left, the so-called useless mouths or the inessentials left, that they would take a lot of essentials along with them. And these essentials would be people engaged in, emergency services, vital services, people engaged in war production equipment, particularly in Calcutta. There was lots of labor were tied to that. Lots of labor tied to industry, which is, again, important and linked to the war effort. They didn't want those people to leave. So they saw this entire thing as if it was a sort of managerial issue. Let's try and get one sort to leave and another sort to stay.
Right. But it must have been hard for you to sort of determine the kind of extent of, personal losses of people. Some of them obviously couldn't return, but those who did, they found their houses ransacked and
yes, like my mother's left, and when she came back, her house was completely ransacked. And this happened in other cities as well, because when the population fled, leaving their homes, thieves had a run of the place. So my mother remembers that there was nothing made of iron, not a single nail, not a single bolt. Everything was taken out, because I think metal was important at that time. We had a war on. And obviously it had a value. So thieves had completely, taken everything out, every piece of wood. The house was just, a shell. So that happened a lot. The question you ask relates to, this isn't a book. I mean, I mentioned my mother's story, but and there are lots of others who have similar stories who I've met. The reason why I've tried to avoid making it of, a sort of a book based on memory is a lot of the memories are difficult to corroborate. People say, yes, my grandfather fled, but they don't know when he fled. They're not entirely sure how long he stayed away. They're not entirely sure whether he rented a place, if so, how much. So these are memories of people who were very young at that time, who've, unfortunately, their parents and grandparents haven't really recorded this time very, very well. So I've tried to rely on sources. I've tried to rely on historical sources. I have weaved in some personal narrative. I had a friend tell me that I should have done more. But the reason why I haven't done more of that is that I wanted this to be a solidly factual book, one that is underpinned by proper sourcing and research. And I didn't want to rely entirely on people's memories and telling the stories, even though some of the stories were interesting. And I keep hearing stories all the go. I mean, this book has traveled to many cities. And wherever I go, there's someone that comes up to me and says, hey, I had someone who was caught in this trouble, and then they tell me a story about it. So I've picked up many stories from people about what their parents or their grandparents went through the flood. And not necessarily in Madras, outside as well.
Right, exactly. And there's another aspect to it of course, that was also a very crucial time in the history of the Indian freedom movement. And you write extensively on Subhash Chandra Bose, for instance, and the Indian National Army. And this question of freedom, how do you see this whole perception of the threat, which was completely misguided and misplaced, shaping the course? I mean, you write about it, but if you could give us a sense of how did it shape the course of the freedom movement, and also how the British saw the freedom at that point of time.
Well, I tried to make the case, and this is, I don't know whether everyone would agree with me on this, because I've read the counter view on this, but I tried to make the case that the war actually divided the Congress in a very, very significant way, in significant ways, actually. I mean, you had Bose, for instance, who clearly, left India and then went to Berlin, and then later went to Japan, and then came to head the INA, but that was very late. The INA was founded well before Subhash Chandra Bose actually came to Singapore and declared that he was the head of the provisional government of Free India. But it divided. You had Gandhi taking a particular view on this, opposing any attempt that for Indians to join the British war effort, because he thought war was that would mean signing up for non-violence or violence, which was not a part of his creed. We had people like Nehru who seemed willing to at least talk to the British about trying to win concessions now that they're fighting a war in exchange for support. And that was a view that people had. And I do record the tensions that existed between the leaders at this time, and the different positions they took on the war. Rajaji as well sang a slightly different tune. So, yes, it did impact the nationalist movement. And it did, I think it did influence. I tried to make a suggestion that it did, you cannot discuss the momentous events of 1942, the Cripps mission, and Gandhi's eventual call for the British to quit India, without seeing it in the context of Japan's successes and so on. We need to at least relate the historical background, because when Cripps was here, many things happened. I mean, the Japanese bombed places in India. They took down merchant ships. They bombed Colombo. They took the Andamans, and all this while he was talking to the Congress and others about some kind of constitutional reform in exchange for support for the war effort.
How do you see this this whole story linked to Japan's ambition to be a major player in Southeast Asia, and of course, and the fact that when the attack in Malaya and Singapore happened, it also sort of burst that myth of the invincibility of the British Empire, isn't it?
Burst the Indian myth? What did you say?
The myth of the invincibility of...
the invincibility of the invincibility of the British Empire took a knock. The invincibility or the idea that, look, of, in a way, white superiority in terms of, waging war, also took a knock, because the Japanese just ripped through, Southeast Asia. And there was not a single battle that either the Dutch or the British won at that time, at this period. So it sort of raised the question in India that, look, if you're upping and leaving Malaysia, and if you're surrendering in Singapore, and if you're, vacating and retreating in Burma, what are you going to do if the Japanese come to India? You're going to do the same thing. You're not stayers. You're just here because, it suits you at the moment. But the moment it doesn't suit you, you'll all up and leave. And certainly that idea was echoed in the Central Legislative Assembly among Indian politicians. And it was something that made Indians realize that, look, the British may not be here to stay forever.
Another interesting aspect that I found in the book is the story of the zoo, how the animals at the Madras Zoo were slaughtered on the eve of the threat, on the eve of the attack. Of course, that happened, and that included, of course, lions and tigers, because of the fear that once the bomb attack will happen, the enclosures will open, and the animals will come into the city. So this whole you write, I think somewhere towards the end of the book, that it had its precedence in during the war. England, for instance, had done that previously. How do you look at this whole thing? Because do you think they could have found another way of, or how did it happen? Because, it's just so bizarre. It sounds really, really bizarre, no?
It does. It does. In fact, it's one of the reasons I think, and the story has been known in Madras that, hey, there was this time when I grew up with the story as well, that animals were shot during this time, and it's referred to in some books and some articles in history. It's something that's impossible to miss, even in fiction. I mean, there's a friend of mine who's written a novel set in the period who mentions this. The novel is still to be published, but it apparently receives a mention because he called me and told me to ask me whether the story is true. So it is such a curious story that I'm not surprised that it evokes an interest. But to me, it was emblematic of the kind of panic that gripped Madras in this case. There was panic in Calcutta as well. There was a plan in Calcutta also to evacuate the animals there. So that's one side of it, that look, we need to get the animals out. Otherwise, they might roam the streets if bombs fall in, and they might start, the dangerous animals might start, hurting people or killing them or eating them or whatever. So that was a fear. In Madras, the Corporation Commissioner did try for months to move them to other zoos, Mysore, Hyderabad, and so on. But all he got was mail saying the matter is under consideration. Typical Babu replies saying, it's consideration, saying neither yes or no. And then it came to a stage where there was this so-called military intelligence that, hey, the Japanese are going to attack anytime tomorrow. And that's when Governor Hope's government issued orders that all the dangerous animals should be shot dead. And within I think within a few minutes, they were just in and they just picked out the animals that they thought should be shot. They included venomous snakes also, crocodile, reptiles, and other things. And apart from tigers and bears and other things, panthers and so on, and shot them dead. And then, this story gets a couple of lines. I think what I tried to do was to get into the corporation records and find more details about this story, flesh it out a little more, because all I'd read about it was in terms of a line or two or a reference to the corporation commissioner who mentions it in his biography. I tried to piece together as much information that was available outside these sources to tell the story. And then when I was looking at the story, I found that this was not unusual. I mean, people did this in places like Warsaw and Berlin and London and so on. So the idea of killing zoo animals was, animals were victims of World War II and in other places. And not just animals, in places like Britain, pets were victims too. I mean, there were actually orders to put, there were suggestions that pets be best put to death because the war might create, might cause them more suffering if they were alive. So there were people in Britain who killed their cats and dogs in the hundreds of thousands. So that's another more bizarre story in a way.
But this Madras Zoo story, like, the larger story of the Great Flap, is also, do you think, is also one of the untold stories in a way, isn't it?
I think it is untold in terms of some details. I wouldn't say it has never been told. For instance, it receives a mention in my friend Indivar Kamtekar's essay called Shiver 42. It has a mention of a couple of lines in another histories written by Srinath Raghava and Yasmin Khan, but they're just a couple of lines there. What I tried to do was to recount it in some more detail because there were debates in the Madras Corporation as it happened. So maybe I went beyond and looked at some other sources. There was a value put to the animals. There was the
price of
the price of the animals was debated. There were issues of whether it should have happened at all or not. There was a corporation governor's defense of why they should be killed, its efforts to move them. So those things perhaps have not been told. But the fact that it happened is certainly not something I discovered first. Others have talked about it.
The largest story, Mukund, and that's the real question about the Great Flap. We began with how it remains a story that has largely been scarcely been written and largely been forgotten. When you were researching, I mean, you quote two of the books, I think, in the foreword that you drew on. What kind of sense did you get from these material that you sort of accessed for this book?
Many things. I mean, couple of things. One is that I think among the many reasons why the flap may have been ignored. One is the invasion never happened. So people may have thought that, yeah, okay, if the invasion never happened, maybe it's not an important historical event. I'm trying to suggest that even if the invasion didn't happen, many other things happened, like panic, flight, rumors, and so on, which were very real. And also, there may have been an impact on the Indian national movement, which you also may have either underplayed in some manner. So those are 2 points. Maybe people thought that it didn't happen. The other thing that struck me when I was looking at it is, and this could be a reason why it was not ignored, is that I looked at newspapers during that period, and I would have imagined today if 75%, let's say conservatively, or 25% of Bombay, or 30-40% of Calcutta fled, there would have been page one stories. There would have been pictures of empty streets. There would have been personal accounts of why someone has fled. There would have been details that not just history, the press would have covered in a sort of sustained fashion. And ironically, no. And I can understand the Indian papers, I mean, the British Indian papers not bothering much about it. The Times of India, but then in British hands, the Statesman was. But there were nationalist newspapers, including my former newspaper, where there was hardly any reporting. Well, not just mine, the Indian Express, others. There was hardly any reporting on what was a humanitarian kind of issue, right? People flee. And it was, the news is buried in single columns here, and, it doesn't get much mention. And I think, and I'm suggesting this, I mean, you're a journalist, so you might have a better view on this than myself. So I think it's a reflection of maybe what people saw as what journalism constituted at the time, which was to report statements and press releases and so on and so forth. And this is what we got. The chief secretary puts out something, it was there in the paper. But I didn't see anyone getting out there and doing a story and of actual people moving out, what they were thinking, what they were fearing. You just had these reports saying, okay, additional trains have been commissioned for, to get the traffic out, and so on and so forth. So maybe that's another reason why it didn't get they didn't get the due it deserved. The third reason, I think, is, and I suggest that I think a lot of the writing on this period, or a lot of the writing of history generally has during this period has depended on what are called fortnightly reports. These were reports filed by the chief secretary of every province, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, to the Home Secretary, who was then a man called Conran Smith. And these have generally been gone through the archives. What I think much of the information I have mined and I found interesting, information about Cuttack, for instance, where the governor was in a panic over possible invasion, and kept. These were there in the communications, some of them secret, some of them telegrams, between Viceroy Renitro and the various governors. So a lot of the interesting stories about Bombay, the Bombay governor was also, constantly worrying about, what would happen if the Japanese attacked Bombay, because it was an island, the exit routes were not many, and so on and so forth. So much of this is contained in that correspondence. And I think the more I read about that correspondence, the more I found material that was relevant to the story of the flap. So I think maybe
right.
that may help me in some ways.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I think it really it's something that perhaps makes sense if you look back. That perhaps because it was a human interest story, it was largely forgotten from the.
Yeah, we didn't do much human interest journalism then. I mean, just think back, to to COVID and the contract workers and the labor leaving, and the entire media was chasing that story quite legitimately. I mean, and quite well. Some of them did it very, very well, particularly some of them in the visual media. And we have nothing similar from that period. The other thing that we don't have is we don't have anyone who's kept a detailed account of flight and panic. And I think this reflects on us as Indians. We're not very good record keepers of events like this in terms of diaries and so on. Don't do it as well as people in other countries.
That's absolutely true. And that's the reason, that this book becomes really, really important for readers in India and elsewhere. So thank you so much for joining us, Mukund. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.